I remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Saturday evening in late September, and the air smelled like candles and white roses. My wife, Carol, had spent 3 weeks planning that party. 3 weeks of phone calls and tastings and arguments about centerpieces. She wanted everything to be perfect for our daughter. And I have to say, standing there in the banquet hall of the Riverside Inn with a glass of champagne in my hand, watching the light catch the crystals on the ceiling, it really did look perfect. Her name is Elaine, our daughter. She was 28 years old that night, and she was the most beautiful I had ever seen her. She had her mother's dark hair, and she was wearing this simple ivory dress, nothing too fancy, and she was glowing. That is the only word for it. Glowing. The way a person glows when they believe they are exactly where they are supposed to be in life. And standing next to her was Marcus Webb. I want to be careful about how I describe Marcus, because I need you to understand how I saw him that night, before I knew anything. He was 34 years old, tall, well-built, with a confident way of standing that made you think he had played sports in college, maybe still worked out regularly. He had light brown hair, kept neat, and a smile that came easily. The kind of smile that made other people feel like they had said something clever. He wore a dark navy suit that fit him well, and he shook hands firmly, and he remembered names. I noticed that. He would meet someone once, and then 20 minutes later call them by name across the room and ask a follow-up question about something they had mentioned. People liked that. People always liked that. He had been dating Elaine for 14 months. They had met at a conference in Chicago where they both happened to be speaking on adjacent panels about financial technology. Elaine works in data analytics. Marcus ran a consulting firm. At least, that is what he told us. He proposed to her in June, at a restaurant overlooking the harbor. He had arranged for a string quartet to play her favorite piece, Debussy's Clair de Lune, which I found impressive because most men her age would not even know she had a favorite piece of classical music. Elaine called us that night, crying happy tears, and Carol cried too, and I sat there feeling the particular mixture of pride and loss that fathers of daughters know very well. You spend your whole life keeping someone safe, and then one day you realize the job description is changing and there is nothing you can do about it. I liked Marcus well enough. That is the honest truth. I did not love him yet, the way you eventually come to love the people your children choose, but I liked him. He was respectful when he spoke to Carol. He asked me thoughtful questions about my career. I had spent 32 years working in civil engineering, mostly bridge infrastructure, and most people's eyes glaze over when I mention that. Marcus did not let his eyes glaze over. He asked follow-up questions. Smart ones. He said something once about load distribution and tension cabling that showed he actually understood basic structural engineering principles. I remember thinking, well, this one did his homework. So that evening in September, I was genuinely happy. I was. I stood near the back of the banquet hall with a glass of champagne, and I watched my daughter laugh at something her fiancé had whispered to her, and I thought, she is going to have a good life. That is all any father really wants, just for the life to be good. Marcus stood up to give his speech around 8 o'clock. Someone tapped a glass, and the room settled, and he stood there at the front of the room with Elaine at his side, and he took a breath, and he smiled, and he said, I want to start by thanking the two people in this room who made Elaine who she is, Robert and Carol, because without the way they raised her, without the values they gave her and the love they surrounded her with, she would not be the extraordinary woman standing next to me right now, and I would not be the luckiest man in this room. The room applauded. Carol squeezed my arm. I felt the back of my throat tighten the way it does when you are trying not to get emotional in public. Marcus went on. He talked about the first time he saw Elaine at that conference in Chicago. He said he watched her give her presentation, and he thought, I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that woman. He talked about their future, the home they were going to build together, the family they hoped to have. He said the word prosperity, and he gestured warmly at the room, at all of us, and he said, the prosperity of everyone in this room matters to me, because you are her people, and her people are my people now. He raised his glass. Everyone raised theirs. The room said cheers and drank, and the music came back on, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful moment. And that is when Elaine leaned close to me. She did it quietly, the way you do something you do not want anyone else to notice. She turned slightly toward me, under the pretense of reaching for a canapé from the tray nearby, and she brought her lips close to my ear, and she said it so softly I almost thought I had imagined it. "Dad, investigate him." Then she straightened up, smiled at her aunt who was approaching from across the room, and walked away as if nothing had happened. I stood very still for a moment. The noise of the party continued around me. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed loudly near the bar. The string duo in the corner moved into a new song. And I stood there holding my champagne, and I replayed those 3 words in my head. Investigate him. I looked across the room at Elaine. She was hugging her aunt now, laughing at something. She did not look back at me. She did not look distressed. She looked like a happy woman at her own engagement party. But those words, the way she had said them, low and calm and deliberate, not like someone who had had too much champagne, not like a joke, like someone delivering a piece of information they had been waiting to deliver. I found Carol near the dessert table about 20 minutes later, and I started to say something to her, and then I stopped. I did not know why I stopped. Some instinct, something told me to wait, to think. So I smiled at my wife, and I told her the shrimp appetizers were excellent, and I spent the rest of the evening watching Marcus Webb. And here is the thing, I noticed nothing wrong. He was gracious and warm and funny. He helped an elderly guest find a chair when she looked unsteady. He spent 10 minutes talking with our neighbor Harold about his woodworking hobby, genuinely engaged, asking to see photos on Harold's phone. He kissed Elaine on the temple twice during the evening, soft and easy, like a man who was comfortable, who felt at home. When we said goodnight, he shook my hand with both of his, and he said, "Robert, thank you for welcoming me into your family." I mean that sincerely. I drove home that night, and I did not sleep. I lay in the dark next to Carol, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the way Elaine had said those words, the tone of it, the precision. My daughter is not a dramatic person. She does not create situations. She is methodical, careful. She spent 6 months reviewing data before she chose which neighborhood to buy her condo in. She does not whisper alarming things at parties for no reason. Something was wrong. She knew something, and for reasons I did not yet understand, she could not tell me directly. She needed me to find it. I decided I would not ask her about it. Not yet. Whatever was happening, she had chosen to communicate this way, quietly, with deniability, at a public event where we could not have a real conversation. There was a reason for that. Maybe she was not sure of what she knew. Maybe she was afraid of how I would react. Maybe there were eyes on her in some way I did not understand. I did not know. But I trusted her. She was my daughter, and she was one of the smartest people I knew, and she had told me to investigate him. So I was going to investigate him. I want to be honest about something. I am 61 years old. I am a retired civil engineer. My investigative skills, if you can call them that, amount to 30 years of reading technical reports and knowing how to identify when a structural assessment is missing something important. I am not a private detective. I am not particularly tech-savvy. I know how to use a computer, and I know how to read a document carefully, and I know how to ask questions in a way that does not immediately telegraph what I am looking for. That last skill turns out to be useful. I started with what I knew. Marcus Webb. Age 34, ran a consulting firm called Pinnacle Group Advisors. Based, according to his business card, in Boston. Had attended, according to things he had mentioned in conversation, the University of Vermont for his undergraduate degree, and then got an MBA from a school in London, which he always referred to vaguely as a program abroad. The first thing I did, the morning after the engagement party, was a simple internet search. I sat at my kitchen desk with my second cup of coffee while Carol was on the phone with her sister in Denver, and I typed Marcus Webb into the search bar. You would be surprised how clean his results were. Not empty, but clean. There was a LinkedIn profile, a professional headshot, that same easy smile. Listed his current company, Pinnacle Group Advisors, described as a boutique financial and operational consulting firm. His work history before that listed a position at a company called Meridian Capital Consulting from 2017 to 2020, and before that, something called Blue Ridge Financial from 2014 to 2017. His education listed University of Vermont, Bachelor of Science in Economics, 2012. No mention of the London programme. There was also a brief mention of his name in a local Boston business journal from 2021, a small piece about new consulting firms gaining traction in the post-pandemic economy. Marcus was quoted saying, "We focus on helping mid-market companies identify and close the gap between what they think their operations look like and what they actually look like." A good quote. The kind of thing that sounds meaningful but is technically vague. That was essentially it. For a man of 34 who had been running a consulting firm for several years, it was a surprisingly small digital footprint. I had colleagues my age with more online presence. I had neighbors who were retired school teachers with more online presence. I thought about that. A small digital footprint can mean different things. Some people are simply private. Some people are old-fashioned and do not post much. But it can also mean something else. It can mean someone has been careful. I called my son-in-law Richard. He is married to my older daughter Susan, and he works in commercial insurance, and he is, in the kindest possible terms, a gossip. He knows everyone, and he remembers everything, and he has an instinct for information that I have always found mildly exhausting at family dinners, but now found very valuable. I told Richard I was thinking of putting together a small financial gift for Elaine and Marcus, and I wanted to understand Marcus's business a bit better before I did. This was plausible. It sounded like something a careful father might do. Richard accepted it completely. He did not know much about Pinnacle Group advisors specifically, but he said he would make some calls. He knew people in the Boston financial community through his insurance work. He would ask around, he said, casually, nothing obvious. He called me back 2 days later. He said, "Bob, I made a few calls. Your guy Marcus, nobody in the Boston finance community knows him well. Like, at all. One person I talked to said they had heard the name Pinnacle Group but could not tell me anything specific about what they do or who their clients are. Another person looked him up and said his firm is registered as an LLC, but there's no real public client list. No case studies, nothing that boutique consulting firms usually put out there to attract business." I thanked Richard and told him not to mention this to Susan or Carol. He lowered his voice conspiratorially and said, "Of course not, Bob. Of course not." Richard loves nothing more than being trusted with something. I thought about what he had told me, a consulting firm with no visible clients, no reputation in its own city. It was possible. Some firms work entirely through referrals and never need an external profile. But combined with everything else, it added to the texture of something I was beginning to feel rather than understand. 3 weeks after the engagement party, Elaine called me on a Tuesday evening. We talked about ordinary things for a while. Her work, Carol's new garden project, a trip she and Marcus were planning to Portugal for the following spring. She sounded normal, happy. I waited. Near the end of the call, I said carefully, "Elaine, that was a wonderful party. You both seemed very happy." "We are," she said. "Marcus gave a beautiful speech," I said. "He did," she said. Silence for a moment. I said, "I have been thinking about what you said to me that night." Near the end of the evening. Another pause, shorter than I expected. She said, "Dad, I just want you to know that I love you, and I trust your judgment more than anyone else's." That was all. She moved on quickly to something else, and we finished the call, and I sat for a long time after we hung up. She was confirming it. She was not walking it back. She could not say more, or would not say more, but she wanted me to keep going. I thought about the name of his first employer, Blue Ridge Financial. I searched it and found a company by that name based in Asheville, North Carolina. Small investment advisory firm. Still operating. I called their main number the following morning, told the receptionist I was a former colleague of Marcus Webb's trying to reconnect, and asked if she could confirm he had worked there. There was a pause. She said she was not able to confirm employment records. I said, "Of course, I understand. Can you just tell me, was there ever a Marcus Webb in the Asheville office, just generally?" She said, "Hold on." I heard her speak to someone away from the phone. Then she came back and said, "I'm sorry, sir. I don't see a Marcus Webb in our records at all." I thanked her and ended the call. He had never worked there. Or Blue Ridge Financial in Asheville was not the Blue Ridge Financial on his resume. Either way, something on his resume was false. I need you to understand what this felt like. Because it would be easy to say, well, you found a discrepancy, good detective work, and move on. But I was not a detective. I was a father. A 61-year-old man who had spent his whole adult life building things that were meant to hold weight and last. And I was sitting at my kitchen desk, looking at evidence that the man my daughter was going to marry had built a version of himself that was not real. And she knew it. She had known something was wrong, and she had come to me. I started to think more carefully. Elaine had not gone to the police. She had not broken off the engagement. She had not come to me openly. She had whispered 3 words at a party and then resumed smiling, which meant either she was afraid of him or she was managing a situation that was more complicated than it appeared. Or both. I decided I needed to find out who Marcus Webb actually was before any of this came into the open. I have a friend named Gerald Park. We served on the same county infrastructure committee for several years before I retired. Gerald spent 20 years as a financial crimes investigator for a federal agency before he went into private consulting. I called him and I said, Gerald, I need a favor. I need it to be quiet. He said, tell me what you have. I told him the name, the company, the resume discrepancy with Blue Ridge Financial, and the thin digital footprint. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, give me 2 weeks. It took him 11 days. He called me on a Thursday morning and he said, Bob, sit down. I am serious. Sit down. I sat down. Gerald told me that Marcus Webb, under that name, had a clean record. No criminal history, no civil judgments, nothing. But the name Marcus Webb, as an identity, only appeared to have existed since 2013. Before 2013, there was almost nothing. No school records accessible, no address history. Nothing that would suggest a childhood and adolescence. The social security number attached to the name was valid, but had a registration pattern that Gerald described as unusual for a natural-born citizen. He said, Bob, here is what I think, and I want to be careful because I cannot be certain without more resources than I have right now. But I think Marcus Webb is not the name he was born with. I think this identity was constructed, and I think whoever he was before 2013, something happened that made him want to start over. I said, what kind of something? Gerald said, the pattern I am seeing, the clean restart, the carefully managed online presence, the resume that checks out on the surface but falls apart when you actually call anyone. This is consistent with 2 scenarios in my experience. Either he was in witness protection at some point and left it, which would actually explain the social security anomaly, or he was hiding from a legal matter, civil or criminal, that he did not want following him. I said, which do you think it is? Gerald was quiet for a moment. He said, Bob, I found a civil lawsuit from 2011 in a Maryland court, a fraud case. The plaintiff was a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Haynes. She was suing a man named Daniel Croft for fraudulently inducing her to invest her entire retirement savings, $420,000, in a real estate venture that did not exist. The case was settled confidentially in 2012. The defendant, Daniel Croft, was represented by a court-appointed attorney. After the settlement, Daniel Croft disappeared from public records entirely. He paused. He said, I found a photograph from a Baltimore newspaper, a brief article about the lawsuit when it was filed. There is a photo of the defendant entering the courthouse. He emailed me the photo while we were on the phone. I opened it. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, a man in a dark jacket with his head turned slightly away from the camera. He was younger, the hair was darker. But the build, the way he held himself, the profile of his jaw, it was Marcus. I did not say anything for a moment. Gerald waited. Outside my window, a car was moving slowly down our street, the sound of it ordinary and calm, and the world seemed to be continuing without any acknowledgement of what I had just seen. I said, Gerald, a retired schoolteacher. He said yes. I said he took her entire retirement savings. Gerald said, yes, Bob. He did. I closed my eyes for a moment. I thought about Elaine, about her condo, which she had bought herself carefully after months of research, about her savings account, which she had told me once was her safety net, something she never wanted to be without because she had seen too many people her age without one. I thought about Marcus at the engagement party, raising his glass and talking about prosperity and the future of the family. I said, Gerald, how did Elaine find out? He said, I do not know, but she found something. I thanked Gerald and I ended the call and I sat in my kitchen for a very long time. The anger came slowly. That is not how people describe anger usually. People describe it as sudden, a flash, a wave. But for me it was slow. It built the way a structure fails, incrementally, one element at a time, giving way until there is no longer anything holding the whole thing up. I thought about that poor woman, Dorothy Haynes. Retired schoolteacher, 60, maybe 65 years old, the age I am now, spending her whole working life accumulating something to live on, something to feel safe with. And a young, charming man with an easy smile had looked at her and seen a resource, had said all the right things and shown her a future that did not exist and taken everything she had built. And now that same man was planning a wedding with my daughter. I needed to talk to Elaine, but I needed to do it carefully. I did not know if she was safe. I did not know how much she knew or how he might react if he suspected she had told anyone. I thought about the fact that she was still engaged to him, still living, as far as I knew, in the same relationship. She had not run. She had reached out to me in the quietest way possible. There was a reason for that. I called her on a Friday afternoon when I knew Marcus would be at what he called client meetings. I asked if I could take her to lunch the following day. Just the two of us. A restaurant near her office, neutral ground, public. She said yes without hesitating. She said, "Yes, Dad, I'd like that." We sat across from each other at a small Italian place with paper tablecloths, and I ordered soup and she ordered nothing, and I looked at my daughter's face and I said, "How much do you know?" She looked out the window for a moment, then she looked back at me and her eyes were steady. She said, "Enough." She told me that 4 months ago she had been helping Marcus organize some digital files for a business presentation. He had been careless, she said, or maybe just comfortable. She had found a folder nested inside another folder inside what she thought was a financial template. In that folder were documents, old documents, legal correspondence, a name she did not recognize, Daniel Croft, and a settlement agreement that was partially redacted but clear enough in its meaning, and a photograph, an old personal photograph of a man she recognized immediately. She had not said anything. She had closed the folder and finished what she was doing, and she had spent the following 3 months trying to decide what to do. I said, "Elaine, why didn't you come to me immediately?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Because I wasn't sure if it was what I thought it was, and because I was scared. Not of him exactly. I don't think he's violent, but scared of what it would mean. Scared of being wrong, scared of being right." I said, "Are you scared of him?" She said, "I don't think he would hurt me physically. But Dad, he is very, very good at convincing you that your version of reality is wrong. There have been moments in the past few months where I have doubted what I saw, where he has said something so reasonable and warm that I have thought, maybe I misread those documents. Maybe there is an explanation. He does that. He makes you doubt yourself." I reached across the table and I held her hand. I said, "You did not misread them." I told her what Gerald had found. I told her about Dorothy Haynes. I watched my daughter's face as I said it, and I watched something settle in her, some last remaining doubt. It resolved. Her eyes got wet, but she did not cry. She blinked twice and she breathed and she said, "I knew it." She said, "I need this to happen in the right way, Dad. I need it to be real. I need him to not be able to talk his way out of it." I said, I know that. We are going to do this right." We spent an hour at that table talking quietly, working out what we knew and what we still needed and what the right next step was. Elaine was clear-headed and precise. She was afraid, but she was not falling apart. She was my daughter and she was extraordinary. And looking at her across that table, I felt the particular grief of a father who realizes the world tried to use his child's goodness against her. Because that is what predators do. They look for the good people, the trusting ones, the ones who want to believe in the version of the world you are showing them. We agreed on a plan. Gerald connected us with a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Sousa, who specialized in civil fraud. Patricia reviewed everything Gerald had compiled and added her own assessment. She said the documentation, while not airtight for criminal prosecution, was sufficient to expose Marcus, or Daniel, in a very significant way. She also told us something that changed the shape of everything. She said, "There is something else you should know. The Dorothy Haynes case was not the only one. The civil settlement had a confidentiality clause that suppressed it. But my network is wide. I found 2 other women. One in Pennsylvania, 2009, a similar scheme, a real estate investment opportunity that vanished. A settlement also confidential, one in Virginia, 2013, just after he appears to have changed his identity. That one did not go to court. The woman, she was elderly and by that point too exhausted to pursue it. She told a consumer protection advocate what had happened, but nothing came of it. I sat in Patricia's office and I listened to this, and I thought about those women, 3 of them that we knew of. 3 lives diminished by the same man with the same smile. And then I thought about Elaine, about what his plan for her might be. She had a good income, she had savings. She had a father who could be positioned as a resource, a retired engineer with investments, a network of professional contacts. I thought about Marcus at the party saying her people are my people now. Elaine was not a retired schoolteacher. Elaine was sharp and successful and not obviously vulnerable, which meant he had either gotten more ambitious or more careful. Or both. We had to decide how to confront this. Patricia laid out the options. We could go to law enforcement, but given the age and confidentiality of the previous cases and the lack of a completed fraud in Elaine's situation, that path was uncertain and slow. We could expose him directly to Elaine's family and his own social circle, but that was dangerous. He might disappear, he might become hostile, he might find a way to discredit the information. Or we could confront him directly, in a controlled setting, with everything laid out, with people present, and let the weight of the truth do what it does. Elaine chose the third option. She said, "I want to look him in the eyes when he knows it's over. I want to see what he actually is, when there is nowhere left to hide." We planned it carefully. Patricia would be present. Gerald would be there. Carol needed to know, and telling her was one of the hardest conversations of my life. I sat my wife down on a Sunday afternoon, and I told her everything, and I watched her face go through grief and rage and love in that order, and at the end she said, "We protect our daughter. That's all, we protect Elaine." We decided to hold it at our house. Elaine would invite Marcus to a family dinner, an ordinary one, nothing significant. She was calm and skilled enough to manage that. She had been managing it for months. The night was a Wednesday in November, cold outside, the kind of cold that feels purposeful. Carol had made a roast because she believed even in the worst moments a table should have food on it. Patricia and Gerald arrived first, and I put them in the study off the main hallway. The plan was simple. Elaine and Marcus would come in, we would sit for a few minutes, and when the moment was right, Elaine would open the door to the study. They arrived at 7. Marcus came in smiling. He was wearing a grey sweater, he looked relaxed. He handed Carol a bottle of wine with a little bow and said, "Carol, you look wonderful." He shook my hand. He said, "Robert, thank you for having us." His hand was warm, his grip was steady. We sat in the living room. Carol brought out something warm to drink. Marcus talked easily about a project he said he was working on, a company in Hartford he was helping restructure. He was animated, detailed, convincing. I watched him and I thought about how many rooms like this one he had sat in. How many ordinary evenings like this had served as the staging ground for something else. Elaine sat next to him. She was remarkable. She smiled at the right moments and asked the right questions and gave nothing away. I thought, she gets this from her mother. I waited for what felt like the right opening, and then I said, "Marcus, I hope you don't mind. I wanted to have a conversation with you this evening. About the future. About some things I've been thinking about." He smiled easily. "Of course, Robert, of course." He settled back slightly, that comfortable posture, a man who expects to be charmed when needed. I said, "I've been doing some reading, some research, about financial consulting, about the kind of work you do." He nodded. He said, "It's a wide field." "Happy to explain anything." I said, "Yes. I'd like you to explain some things. I'd like you to start with Blue Ridge Financial in Asheville." The first flicker. Very brief, a small adjustment behind his eyes. Then the smile again, easy, professional. He said, "Of course. I was there from 2014 to 2017, on the advisory side mostly. I said, "That's interesting, because when I called their Asheville office, they had no record of you." A pause, longer this time. He said, "There might have been some administrative confusion. I was brought in as a contractor, not a direct employee, so sometimes," I said, "Marcus. Or do you prefer Daniel?" The room went very quiet. I heard the house settle around us, that soft sound old houses make. Marcus did not move for a moment. Then something happened to his face. The smile did not fall. It dissolved, like watching something that was never quite solid, becoming transparent. Underneath it was something else. Not panic. Calculation. Even then, even caught, he was calculating. He said very carefully, "I don't know what you think you found." And Elaine stood up. She walked to the study door and opened it, and Patricia and Gerald came into the room. Patricia introduced herself and told Marcus what she represented and what she had compiled. She laid a folder on the coffee table in front of him. She did not raise her voice. She was calm and professional and absolute. Marcus looked at the folder. He looked at Elaine. He looked at me. And I watched him decide in real time which approach to try. He tried the first one. He looked at Elaine with something practiced and sincere, and he said, "Elaine, I can explain everything in that folder. I know how this looks. But you know me." Elaine said, "I thought I did." He tried sadness. He said there was a past he was not proud of, a time in his life when he made terrible decisions, and he had spent years becoming a different person, a better person, and everything he felt for Elaine was real. Whatever else was true, she was real to him. I said, "Is Dorothy Haynes real to you?" He stopped. I said, "She was a school teacher. She spent 40 years in a classroom. She trusted someone, and she lost everything. Was she real?" He was very still, and then finally, something genuinely human passed across his face. I am not certain what it was. Not quite shame, more like exposure, the feeling of being truly seen after a very long time of never being seen. It lasted only a moment. Then the walls came back up. He said, "What do you want?" Patricia said, "We want you to leave, to end this engagement tonight, to have no further contact with Elaine, and to understand that we have compiled a thorough record of documented history which will be transmitted to the relevant authorities in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Regardless of what you do tonight, this confrontation does not purchase your freedom. Your choices from here forward affect only how quickly and how completely those records move forward." He sat with that for a moment, then he straightened up. He picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair. He did not look at me. He looked at Elaine one more time with that face that had been constructed to inspire trust, and she held his gaze without blinking, my daughter who had been afraid for months and had found her footing, and he looked away first. He walked to the door and he opened it and he left. The sound of his car starting in the driveway, the sound of him driving away. Elaine sat down on the couch and she exhaled. A long, slow exhale, the kind that carries something heavy out with it. Carol sat next to her and put her arm around her, and neither of them said anything. I sat across from them and I looked at my wife and my daughter, and I thought, this is what it means to build something that holds. The weeks that followed were not simple. Elaine went through what she called the inventory of it, looking back through 14 months of relationship and trying to sort what was real from what was performance. That is its own kind of grief, I think. Not mourning a person exactly because the person was never quite real. Mourning the version of the relationship you thought you were in. Mourning the future you had believed in. She called me during that time, sometimes late at night, and we would talk. Sometimes about Marcus, sometimes about nothing related to any of this. Sometimes she just needed to hear a voice that was familiar and safe. I would answer every time. I am her father. That is what you do. Patricia's documentation was transmitted to authorities in Maryland and Virginia. I do not know exactly what came of it legally, because the law moves in ways that are slow and opaque and not always satisfying. But I know the record exists now. I know it has his real name attached to it. I know that the name Daniel Croft is connected to a pattern of behavior that is documented and shared. That matters. What I think about most in the quiet times is Dorothy Haynes. I think about her often. I asked Gerald if he could find a way to reach her, just to let her know that the man who took from her had been found and named and that she was not forgotten. Gerald located her through public records. She was 72 years old and living with her daughter's family in Maryland. He passed my contact information along through her daughter. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon in December. Her voice was soft and a little hoarse, and she said, "I am calling for Robert." I said, "This is Robert." She said, "I understand you found him." I said, "Yes, ma'am, we found him." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you." Just that. Thank you. And I heard in those two words something that had been waiting a very long time to be said. I think about what it takes to trust someone. Genuinely trust them. I have been married for 34 years to the same woman, and I think sometimes about the faith that requires both directions, day after day. I think about how trust is the foundation of almost every meaningful thing in human life. How everything we build on each other's behalf, families, communities, institutions, all of it rests on the belief that the person beside you is who they say they are. People like Daniel Croft, people who construct false selves and move through the world wearing them, they do not just take money. They take something harder to replace. They take a piece of your willingness to believe. And the damage of that radiates outward further than they ever intend, and further than anyone ever fully accounts for. What saved my daughter was not anything I did. I want to be honest about that. What saved my daughter was her own intelligence and her own courage. She found those documents and she sat alone with something terrifying, and she did not panic and she did not run, and she chose, very carefully, the right moment and the right person to reach out to. She trusted her own eyes. She trusted me. She chose to protect herself, and she did it with the same methodical thoughtfulness she brought to everything in her life. I was just the person she handed the thread to. I pulled it. Elaine is doing well now. She went to Portugal last spring as she had planned, but she went with a friend from work, a woman she had known for years. She sent me a photograph from a hillside above Lisbon. Her face in the evening light, and she looked the way she had looked at the engagement party, that glow, but this time it was coming from a different place. Not from the reflection of someone else's promise. From herself. I have it on my desk. That photograph. She is looking at something outside the frame of the picture, something I cannot see, and she is smiling, and she does not look afraid. I am 61 years old, and I have spent my whole career understanding how things are built and how they fail. How the failure is almost always invisible at first. A small thing, a calculation slightly off, a material not quite right for its purpose, and the structure looks fine from the outside, looks solid and complete, and then one day the hidden flaw finds the limit of what it can bear. I think about Marcus Webb, about Daniel Croft, and I think about what it must be like to build your whole life on a foundation that is false, to spend every day maintaining a version of yourself that does not exist, carefully managing every relationship so the seams do not show, to sit at a table with people who believe in you and to know, in whatever part of you is still honest, that the whole thing is suspended over nothing. I have some sympathy for that. I said that to Gerald once, and he looked at me like I had said something strange. But I meant it. Not for what he did to Dorothy and those other women. For none of that do I have any sympathy at all. But for the original wound that must exist in a person who decides that pretending is safer than being known. That sadness is real, even if the choices it produced were unforgivable. I do not know if Daniel Croft will change. I suspect not. I suspect he will find another name and another city and another woman who seems to have something he can use. Maybe he already has. But the record follows him now, even if it takes time. The record is real. And my daughter is safe. That is what I keep coming back to in the end. All the threads of the story, the investigation, the confrontation, the legal process, the grief of it, all of those threads lead back to that one fact. My daughter is safe. She sat across a table from the man she had been going to marry, and she watched him leave, and she stayed. And the next morning, she called me. She said, "Dad, thank you." I said, "Elaine, you did this. Not me. You." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We did it." And I said, "Yes, we did. I am 61 years old. I have built bridges that carry thousands of people every day. But that phone call is the most solid thing I have ever been part of. The world is full of structures that look whole from the outside. Some of them are. Some of them are not. And sometimes the most important thing you can do, the thing that holds everything else up, is to look carefully. To look even when you do not want to find what is there. To look because someone you love asked you to. That is all she asked me. 3 words at a party. And I want to tell you, if someone you trust ever comes to you that quietly, with that much calm and that much fear underneath the calm, listen to them. Just listen, and then go find the truth. Because it is always there. It is always waiting to be found.